Welcome to a new episode of my Dear Kitchen in Helsinki podcast. My guest today is post-doctoral researcher Teea Kortetmäki from the University of Jyväskylä, Finland. And we talked about food justice and its relation to climate change mitigation. The global food system, and especially the current industrial agriculture, has adverse effects on climate change. In return, climate change threatens global food security. We discuss these connections and tensions both globally and in the context of Finland. At the end of the episode, Teea has a question for you, and we'll be happy to receive your comments on the social media platforms. As always, special thanks to my dear friend Ufuk Evcimen for the sound editing. Hi, Teea, and welcome to this podcast interview, and thank you for accepting to do this interview. Today we're going to talk about food justice and its connection to climate change and climate change mitigation. And we're going to talk about it first in general terms, and then I want to come back to especially the context of Finland in the end. But first, before we dive into deeper, can you introduce yourself a little, your academic background, your research interests, and so on?
Thanks for having me here, first of all. So I'm Teea Kortetmäki, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Jyväskylä. My own academic background is in philosophy, especially environmental and food ethics and justice. And in addition to that, I have done for some years empirical food system studies on just transition and sustainable food systems.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so before in previous episodes, in some of the interviewees, we talked about food sovereignty in some cases, but we never talked about the term food justice before. So can you, for our listeners, can you explain what food justice is and also how it is different than food sovereignty, but also giving your own definition of food sovereignty one more time for today's listeners as well?
Yeah, so food justice, basically it concerns how just our food systems are. And this boils down to the fairness of the distribution of different benefits and harms related to food production, consumption, trade, and so on, and justice in the procedures where we make decisions about how food can be produced and sold and so on. So it's also about decision making, and finally it's also about kind of socio-cultural equality, and in a just society, divergent different worldviews can exist and cooperate kind of peacefully with showing respect to each other and still kind of making decisions together. So food justice is a very broad notion and involves many issues regarding fairness, rights, workers' position and food security, for example. I would say that food justice has kind of very broad and systemic and institutional orientation, and its aim as a movement is to reform the current food system. Compared to this, food sovereignty often is depicted as a more radical orientation and as a kind of very bottom-up movement that aims to not so often actually transform the existing system or reform it, but rather to create an alternative food system where kind of this power and right to determine your own food system is at the core of this new system. So I don't see them as opposed in any ways. It's mainly about different kind of points of emphasis and orientation, because in food justice, what we also discuss a lot about kind of decision-making related justice. And there, of course, this idea of food democracy and possibility to participate in making decisions about food systems, deciding about food systems in deliberative manners rather than leaving everything on the markets. I think that they are very kind of similar issues, but these different points of emphasis and different orientation and perhaps a bit more kind of radical and movement-based origin of food sovereignty makes them a bit different.
I'm more involved with food sovereignty, and as I say involved, my readings and so far my discussions have been more around food sovereignty. So even for me, food justice is rather new. So, and I'm seeing it a lot in, for example, US-related discussions, food justice, whereas food sovereignty, even though it should be global, it's more discussed in the global South point of view. Even though I'm, for example, advocating that we should also discuss it in global North aspect as well. But is it really? Is food justice really so much US-based, as my understanding, or can we say that it's actually now a global movement?
Yeah, you are totally correct about this origin issue, so that they come from kind of north and southern parts of America, and that's I think that's one reason why they have remained distinct, because it's also a matter of kind of not merging your ideas into other thinking, but to kind of keep them, and a self-determination of your own thinking and vocabulary is one of the issues. But yeah, originally food justice was coined or established in the US movements first, but it has spread after that to some extent to other parts of the world, especially Western world. I'm in no way an expert of what happens in the eastern part of the globe. It would be interesting to know too. But now we have food justice discussion also in Europe, and here it is strongly connected to, for example, social justice, climate justice, and environmental issues.
Okay. Yeah. Now, to be able to continue talking about food system, and especially its relation to climate change and so on, the first thing I have in mind is to establish what is the real goal of the global food system today?
Well, basically, I think that the existential justification for the global food system is food security, so that it provides people the opportunity to access nutritious, safe, and culturally adequate food. Food security is the basic objective of any food system. But of course, if you think about the global food system, it's a very market-dominated system, and it's in this sense it's quite uncoordinated, at least regarding these kinds of objectives or goals. So I would say that there is no kind of real commonly agreed goal for the global food system, even though we researchers say that it should be food security. And therefore, actually, I think that global food system is occupied by many different sorts of actors with very different goals. And one more point is that if you emphasize the word global, so what is the real goal of food system that is global in nature? Here, my answer would perhaps include the notion that globality has kind of emerged as an attempt to maximize the economic efficiency of supply chains, distribution, specialized distribution of labor and production, and also the aim to maximize the freedom in our consumption and variety. Because without global food system, we certainly wouldn't have more than 20,000 products in our markets.
Yeah. Okay. So now coming to the effects of food system. Now, how does our food system now affecting climate change, and vice versa? How does climate change affecting? And where do environmental, climate, and food justices meet? And where do they create tensions?
That's a very good and complex question. So I try to try to keep it short. But first of all, regarding how our food system affects climate change, of all human-made climatic emissions, at least 1/4 and up to 1/3 is related to food system activities. So it is one of the most significant sources of climatic emissions. On the other hand, climate change itself threatens food production, food security, and creates new risks, and also not just risks, but worsens the conditions of production in many parts of the world that have traditionally been very good agricultural places, because, for example, increasing heat waves, drought, precipitation changes, these all will kind of undermine the previously great conditions for food production in such areas. So it threatens our food system and food security in many different ways. Regarding this intersection between climate, food justice, and environmental justice, well, basically there is the common core, because climate and environmental justice definitely require that human-caused climatic emissions are reduced significantly. And food security, which in my view is the most important single matter within the question of food justice, requires the same reduction of emissions significantly. So in this way, these all go hand in hand. However, there are numerous ways in which emissions can be reduced. And the choices regarding these measures make difference. So actually, the ways in which we reduce our climatic emissions as a humanity may be unjust in many ways, in environmental, food, or even climatic terms. So therefore, this kind of interlinked nature and resolving the climate change challenge tends to create many tensions between these different aspects of justice.
Mm-hmm. So for me, when I listen to your, especially the effects, how food system and climate change are affecting each other, it looks like in its current stage, like a vicious circle, and about the intersections and the tensions. It's like, I think the way to think about these requires a lot of maybe understanding of how these complex systems work and affect each other, so that we don't do point interventions, because we need to understand how each of them is going to, how one point in any of these points will affect the other things as well. So the systemic understanding, I think, very important in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. It's central for creating and identifying good solutions. And I think that in addition to this systemic understanding, we need to emphasize thinking, not just kind of think globally, act locally ways, but actually thinking at all possible levels, which of course is very demanding. But one very basic example of this is that within food justice literature, for example, one common solution is the relocalization of our food systems. And it has also been suggested as one way to get a better control of the environmental impacts of your production, and thereby kind of help reduce environmental impacts in that production. And this, in many cases, to some extent, may be true, but at the same time, relocalizing the food system means adverse livelihood impacts on distant places where the food has been previously imported. Mm-hmm. So there are always local and distant impacts, and these both should be taken into account. And that's, of course, one point where we definitely need researchers who study these things and help us understand them.
Yeah. Now, in one of your articles, you were talking about structural injustice. Now, how do you define structural injustice, especially for our listeners, and how does this fit in the food justice and climate change conversation?
Structural injustice is a phenomenon where we have injustices that nobody can be blamed for. So in a way, structural injustice results from kind of some impact and overall aggregate impact of all sorts of normal and daily activities that we as humans do without any bad intentions. And these activities as such are considered acceptable, morally right, and justified and normal, not at least not wrong in any particular way, but still as a whole, they actually create and reproduce various sorts of injustices. And this is also a sort of vicious circle, because it's really hard to point any single point where you could make a correction and it would correct this kind of injustice. And since it is also kind of ethically very complex to understand that we have injustices that are not clearly somebody's fault, yet someone should do something to them.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that the thought of it's nobody's fault, but then, because normally if you just in very basic terms, if you think about justice and injustice, okay, there is someone doing or some community or something doing the injustice, and then you go to that and you try to make it right. But when you're thinking, okay, there is no single entity to blame, and then how do you move forward gets really complicated, because it I think requires a new kind of understanding of justice, injustice, and to move forward. I mean, to make it right. So yeah, I mean, it's when I especially read your article on that, I mean, it really forced my thinking a lot. So how do we do this? I understand myself that even though I didn't maybe think about it that well before. Yes, it's very hard to say, okay, this person or this community or this thing is making all this injustice. But then how do we go forward?
Yeah, that's a good and tricky question. But I think it's also one of the questions that help us address the climate change challenge and food justice challenge together, because in this structural injustice, the basic idea about our responsibilities for correcting the situation emphasize that we should not seek those who are to be blamed and then say that they should act. Rather, we all find the way of acting together. And when we, for example, think about this discussion about climate action in food systems, there has been a lot discussion about the experiences of blame, especially among farmers, for example, also among consumers, as a result of this news about climatic emissions of certain food products and dietary choices and so on and so on. And we should, here it's really difficult to switch your thinking, but if you can switch it and understand that these news are not about blaming, they demonstrate the problems in our system. And we all participate in the system in different roles. For example, as consumers, as NGO members, as workers in certain communities, and so on. And through these roles and participating in this system, we all kind of are together responsible for trying to change it. And having and admitting this responsibility doesn't mean that you are to blame for something.
I think this question of blaming is also important in a way that in some cases also in the traditional understanding of justice, injustice, and blaming and trying to make right with this blamed entity, there are also sometimes we just throw the problem to this person's or to this entity's hands, and we think that we are now done. Okay, we are making it right, and it's going to be okay. But when we actually share and we understand each one of us or each community or each entity's responsibilities, and change our understanding this way, I think we're also maybe becoming a bit more, constructive criticism. And in a way, maybe it's better to continue this way, because then otherwise we'll just continue blaming each other, and then nothing is going to be done. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I agree totally. And I also think that this kind of new thinking about our responsibilities could have some really empowering potential, because I think that to me, one of the problems of this time in countries like Finland and many industrial Western communities is that they have become very highly individualized culturally, and it's you alone who is acting or not acting, and so on. And for example, it can create almost paralyzing effect when you think that there is horrible climate change and horrible injustices, and now I, as a consumer in a market society, should resolve these problems by making responsible choices in consumption. And it's a really paralyzing idea when we think about this environment where we need to make our consumption choices. And it's I'm not saying that consumption wouldn't be important, but it's, at least for me, it's empowering to understand that consumption is only one thing. There are and can be many more important things, and by kind of putting yourself to some sort of collective action can really be much more than the sum of its parts, and create much greater momentum, and therefore empower yourself and give the sense that you are doing something to change the situation. You are not alone.
Okay, so considering, if you could try to consider then what kind of actions can be or should be made to address and to move forward, not just to address, but to be able to move forward. Can we say some of the things like in the consumption side, for example, increasing awareness, but also somehow, as you say, empowering all kinds of groups, including the ones who are disenfranchised, and somehow make them work together, but trying to find the right tools, maybe, especially to give these people rights and to voice and things like that. So what do you think about that, like the tools to move forward?
I think there are numerous ways, and there is definitely no kind of silver bullet that would do the trick, but I will kind of give a couple of examples that I have encountered in my research and discussions. For example, one way of thinking this is, of course, through policy making. And I think that food is political, definitely already, but it should be repoliticized more strongly. And alongside this, participatory inclusiveness kind of can be improved in many ways. And we could, for example, there are numerous successful experiments on kind of citizen panels or community panels, especially on kind of municipal or regional food governance. So that this kind of citizen involvement already is an improvement. And what we do and can do in schools, for example, is amazing. Mm-hmm. And there we have the new generations where we could both kind of improve participation. We have now done several initiatives how students are engaged in developing more climate smart school meals and solutions therein, for example. And this also...
When you say for students, which age are we talking about?
We have collaborated with students from 10 to 16 years. So it's diverse. Of course, it depends on age. What is the kind of proper level of talking about these things? But this involvement has been really motivating for students, and it also builds this awareness, because of course awareness is also very important for you to know what kinds of things are good and improve the situation. And regarding this, we have quite much kind of misunderstandings about how food system works, or what are the most important sources of environmental impacts and so on. So awareness raising is one example. And I would say that also in countries like Finland, we could and should question the discussion about food that often is reduced to taste and price. So in Finland, especially, for example, this culture of valuing cheap food very highly is very problematic, but there are many customers who question it, and making your arguments. If you think that food price should give a fair share to farmer, you can make this visible and send this message to retailers and those big companies that we have in Finland here, and also call for greater transparency in their practices, because that often also, if you need to make your practices and their impacts more transparent, it simultaneously kind of erases some of the worst practices.
This question of increasing awareness and also inclusiveness is something that I'm thinking a lot about, especially in the question of when, my background is in participatory and co-design. I'm originally a designer, and I didn't question it then that much, but now I'm questioning more. Like when we open a call to say, let's do this participatory, are we really reaching everyone? When we make the tools for the participatory processes, are we reaching everyone, and are we really able to include everyone? That's a bit of a question, especially for me, seeing in many cases the lack of maybe immigrants, let's say, or some communities in this. But I'm going to come to this in a minute. But I think the question of participatory or participation or inclusiveness is also in itself, when you dive into, comes with a lot of questions itself. But you already started talking about Finland, so I want to come to the situation in Finland now. So what are some of the vulnerabilities in Finnish food system? And you can also explain what we mean by Finnish food system, maybe, to make it a bit more understandable.
Yeah, the Finnish food system basically consists of, first of all, food chains, those chains or cycles of production, processing, transportation, retail, and consumption of all the food products that we eat. But it also includes those, for example, economic, political, and sociocultural drivers that influence how food can be produced, sold, and consumed. So it is not only about this from farm to fork view, but also factors influencing those processes. And of course, even when we talk about the Finnish food system and we focus on what happens within our national borders, Finnish food system has kind of global linkages. Definitely, we import lots of raw material and lots of food also. So, but basically, it's this picture of what happens within Finnish boundaries, and kind of keeping in mind what are the kind of output impacts to other people and planet elsewhere as well.
So how just is the Finnish food system? And can you highlight most important justice issues and injustices in Finnish food system?
Yeah, and actually I also realized that I just defined the food system without going to the vulnerability issue. So because vulnerability is of course a bit different thing from justice. We could have a system that is basically quite just but very vulnerable to different disruptions, and it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be sustainable in long term. So regarding these vulnerabilities, I think that the greatest problem perhaps is that many Finnish farms are kind of at the verge of economic viability. They are just getting the livelihood, but nothing more. So they don't have any kind of buffer or adaptive capacity to do actual changes there. And in addition to this, the average age of Finnish farmers is close to 55. And only less than a fifth of farmers are under 40 years. So farmers are generally quite aged. And this is a challenge for continuity in farming. And also our kind of supply chains, especially vegetable, fruit and berry production, are very dependent on short-term foreign labor. This was discussed during the COVID pandemic first wave. And it was, the results or the problems that relate to this dependency were raised by then, and it's also an issue of social justice because even though I hope we don't have much of what would be called slavery, still the working conditions and salaries and such for those workers are not fair. And I would say that these are the two kind of very big challenges as the system as a whole. But when we think about justice, I would say that we do quite well compared to, for example, the United States. Because when I started reading about food justice, the literature was mainly about the US situation, and it's simply horrible. So to modern slavery and such situations are very common. In Finland, situation is better, but the problems concern especially the viability of farming and the livelihood and adaptation challenges of farmers, as I already said. We also have food insecurity, and it has become a normalized phenomenon. It's not just something that happens when we have a sudden economic crisis, but we have normally people on breadlines waiting for charity-based food aid, which is really problematic. And then we, of course, have consumption patterns.
These breadlines also increased since last year because of the COVID. I mean, one of them is very close to where I live, and I'm seeing it getting longer and longer, especially since last year because of the COVID situation and so on.
Yeah, it was really bad, and it's also really kind of tragic that those people who are already kind of in such a bad position that they rely on food charity, they also get more exposed to COVID-related risks because they have to wait for hours to get food and visit small kind of rooms and so on. So it's kind of agglomerating vulnerability. Yeah. So I would say these issues are perhaps the most serious food justice problems in Finland, in addition to the basic fact that Finnish dietary patterns have very problematic impacts on humans and non-human life elsewhere in this planet.
Yeah. Now, if we want to talk about a bit more like policy level and decision making. In this level, do you think the connection in the context of Finland, do you think the connection between food system and climate change are addressed, or at least addressed enough, or at least even discussed enough?
I'm happy to say that the situation has improved drastically in the last couple of years, before that, there was basically just some public discussion and some kind of initiatives of the forerunners. Mm. But now we have the strong momentum, and we have this Finnish climate food program that is now being kind of created to be the strategy for this kind of work. Mm. And I have quite high hopes for this process, and it has increased awareness, and it has also been, to my knowledge, quite inclusive of different viewpoints and perspectives, which is very important. But in this way, I think that the situation is getting better, but definitely it's not kind of sufficient or just yet. And we still have, there is really much power in the markets. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have markets or market power, but we still have so much market power that in addition to this kind of cultural paradigm of consumer freedom as being one of the highest values, and this availability of diversity and variety at maximum and at as low prices as possible, and so on. So we have to learn about how to make food political. And one problem here is that we have really strong kind of interest groups, and people defend their own interests, and kind of collaboration and thinking in this systemic way rather than just thinking from your own viewpoint is still kind of something to be learned.
Now, my next question is also very much related to my own research preparation. Who are marginalized or left behind by the food system in Finland? And especially these marginalized people, how do we include them in the discussions? I mean, some ideas or a path to move forward.
Yeah, actually, it would be very interesting to also hear your reflections upon this, whether we have similar or very different views. But well, basically, people who are in different ways low resourced or unresourced, so that they lack, for example, social capital, monetary capital, cultural capital, to kind of participate and get their voices heard. One good example, of course, of these kind of basic groups that we already know is the low-income households, because the situation often is that you have to struggle so much with your kind of daily survival that you simply don't have any resources or energy to try to find out how you can participate, let alone do that participation. You are just trying to survive. So that's one basic group. But and of course, in this term, for example, those people who are on those breadlines, it's really hard to imagine how they could have kind of resources for participating. But in addition to that, we also have, for example, immigrants, an increasing group, where I think that especially this issue about kind of, well, of course, having resources, but also knowing about our kind of institutions, decision-making culture, and kind of different practices and those informal things that influence very much whether you get your voice heard or not. Mm-hmm. So we have these very tricky questions, and I think that one solution, of course, I think that we can never get all the people heard, and that's also not necessary. There are always some people who are satisfied with others making the decisions, but what would be most important in my mind would be to actually design and experiment new ways and forms of participation, so that to find out what works for these groups. And one interesting finding in this respect, actually as a result of pandemic in our own research project, was that we realized that now that we were forced to make our group interviews through internet systems, it was actually much more inclusive, because earlier we have had meetings in the capital city, and then you can imagine that busy farmers from central, let alone northern Finland, they have no chance of using 2 days to travel there and back and participate in some 1 or 2 hour discussion. Now they are able to participate. Some even participated while doing their field work from their tractors. So this is a kind of promising example of new forms to create inclusiveness. Mm-hmm. But I would also like to hear if you have some thoughts about these kind of marginalized groups and inclusion.
I mean, I certainly agree with the bread lines, first of all, which is also for me, as I said, I'm seeing it physically increasing and all. And also I know that from, I can't remember now her name, but there's the book, The Rise of Food Aid in Europe.
Tiina Silvasti.
Yeah, Tiina Silvasti. I'm trying to get a hold of that book as well, because that's also not just talking about Finland, but in Europe as well. So that's one thing. So these bread lines are one thing. And also, as I said, immigrants, for me, I mean, there are, for example, in different groups, let's say, I'm going to give some names here, like Dodo, for example, when they have interesting this kind of workshops and events, they have some foreigners, but there are mostly people who are already interested, maybe like international students and so on. So they're already interested, and they're going to find, wherever they go, they're going to find some groups that are going to help them get more active. But then there's a whole group of people coming from very different understanding, very different cultures, who are not maybe so used to participation. And they just have their, for example, I mean, there are all these ethnic Middle Eastern, Turkish shops in Itakeskus. There are people who are only buying from them, from those places, and not even so much getting into the Finnish markets, let's say. So why do this happen, and how do we let these people the possibility of consuming locally, for example? Because having some local food system, even if it's very active, doesn't mean that everyone physically close to it is going to be able to get to that. There can be, are there any cultural or social barriers, maybe even language barriers in Finnish case, for example? I mean, I had problems with Reko network, for example, because it goes through Facebook, so very much written, and it's all Finnish. So even though my Finnish is relatively better now, it's still for me not that much of a easy conversation level. So how do I myself, and I'm a food entrepreneur, I am very much in food discussion, but how do I even get myself into that is a question. And also one thing that I've been thinking, especially when I was thinking a lot about food sovereignty, is the right to have rights. Like, in order to be able to have a right to decide your own food system, you have to have a right to have rights. So, for example, let's say refugees. What happens? I mean, how much right do they have so that they can have the right to be included in these discussions? So these are the people. And one other thing that I didn't think before so much, but now I'm thinking, especially in one of my latest interviews, it came up when I asked this question. It's about small farmers. They are, my guest Galina Kallio was talking about how the small farmers are being marginalized. They are the people who are already trying to make things different. And as they are doing it, as they are trying it, they are marginalized. I didn't think so much about that point of view before. And I'm also now myself very much involved in Omama food co-op. So I go and I observe, I talk. I understand now more also the production side as well. So these are the groups right now that I have in mind, and it's very, and this is a very diverse group as well. So it's so one idea I have is to go, especially in the consumer side, like immigrants and so on, to go into their lives and I don't know, their fridges or their relationship with food, to understand their relationship food may be one way to start, to find creative ways to include them and somehow make collaborative interventions together to the system. These are
Yeah, that's very kind of interesting, and I think that one example that you raised actually gives a good idea that in addition to perhaps the potential of internet-like solutions where you can participate from all around the world and all around Finland, we also should go to places where those marginalized people are and act together. So it's not of great help to open a room somewhere and shout out that now we have this all-inclusive space if everything in that setting kind of yells the Finnish traditional kind of way of doing things instead of being sensitive to different approaches and ways. So going to different places and learning about these different cultures, it could have a great potential also in increasing awareness.
Yeah, and also especially not to try to bring all these people together at first, but instead having this one-to-one, very almost intimate questioning, and just talking about food in its own setting, like in their kitchen, maybe in their home, looking at their cupboards together, and having it as more of a dialogue, a conversation, as maybe even storytelling, can actually bring out, instead of asking, so what are your problems with food system or with food? Instead of that, just talking about their relationship with food and their activities related to food in a more telling each other's story kind of setting, I think can bring out things that wouldn't come out when we just directly ask, so what is your idea of, because not everybody actually is themselves trained or even thinking that way. But I'm thinking of a way to create a dialogue so that without so much themselves maybe understanding, they will bring out these issues when talking about just their lives and their relationship with food. I don't know if I could elaborate.
I think it does. It's kind of part of sociocultural food justice to let people express their concerns regarding food in a way that is natural to them. So that they don't have to kind of get themselves to some kind of food system talk or something that is alien, but to talk, for example, in these daily surroundings, precisely.
And also, I'm thinking there can be some things that people may not really want to say if you just directly ask, but it may come out if you actually break the ice, and maybe it's not going to be direct, but under the lines, it's going to mean actually what it really is. So some people can be even, I mean, honestly, my own income was affected by COVID. So my business got affected. So I am now thinking a lot more when I'm doing my food, not for my customers, but at least for myself. I'm thinking a lot about the price of the food, yes. And maybe some people may not be so easily express this. They don't want to be, maybe, I mean. So these kind of things, hard to talk about, hard to admit, or hard to say out loud, may also come out. And these are the most important things, actually, that are affecting people's lives. So yeah, this is a way of, and then, of course, not just analyzing, but then once we see how do we create interventions together, and not just me creating an intervention, but especially with these people, how do we include also them in the intervention phase? So that is a big question, but now it's becoming a lot me talking. But this was a very nice, I think this is also the most that I've talked in an interview. So thank you for that too. But these are my questions in general. Do you have any final words or comments yourself? And what is a question that you want to ask to the listeners so that they think further after listening to this episode?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks. I really like this dialogical part as well, because there's always also much I can learn from different insights and approaches. But what I would like to say and ask is to get shortly back to this idea that our responsibilities for food justice come through different roles that we occupy in the society. And I would like to listeners to ask from themselves, what roles do I occupy and what could be my role in changing the system?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And I highly urge people to think about that and write their opinions in any platform that they listen to this. We can have the discussion on Facebook or especially YouTube version of this. It's harder to get a discussion going in Spotify or iTunes, but we have different platforms that are also very open to people commenting and starting discussions. So I hope they do. And thank you again for the interview. I still have a few articles that I found from your ResearchGate page that I want to read, but especially the justice, as I said, the justice, social injustice, and also nobody's fault article was really interesting. And I don't know if you want to share it with, or if anybody's interested, maybe I can let you know that they want to read that article.
Yeah.
It was heavy, to be honest, for me at first. Some of the first pages I had to read several times, but then I got to the thinking. Yeah. So
yeah, it's quite philosophical, but anyone who is interested in reading my work can freely contact me. I love that, and ask for the pieces if they are not openly available in the internet.
Yeah, and there will be some links that you will provide in the YouTube version, in the description of YouTube version of this interview, so they can start maybe with that and then continue. But thank you, and have a lovely spring day. It's really nice out there. So
thanks for having me. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to know more about the blog behind this podcast, check out www.mydearkitcheninhelsinki.com and find it also on Instagram and Facebook. Have a delicious week.